The mess hall fell silent as Sergeant Marcus Rivera slammed his tray down on the metal table. His voice carried across the room with the authority of someone who believed his opinion mattered more than anyone else's. Sarah Chen kept her eyes focused on her food, but her jaw tightened as she heard the familiar sound of Marcus holding court. "I'm telling you, women have no business in combat roles," Marcus announced to his audience of younger soldiers. "They're too emotional, too weak. When bullets start flying, they'll break down crying or freeze up completely." Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Sarah's table where she sat with her squad mates. Sarah had heard this speech countless times over her 3 years in the military. As one of only 12 women in her battalion, she faced constant scrutiny and doubt. Every mistake was magnified, every success dismissed as luck or special treatment. She had learned to keep her head down and let her performance speak for itself. "What about Sergeant Chen?" asked Private Johnson, a fresh-faced recruit who had joined the unit just 2 months earlier. "She's got more commendations than half the guys here." Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Chen, she's been riding on the coattails of her male squad mates. Put her in real combat under real pressure and she'll crumble like a house of cards. Mark my words." He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Women can't handle combat. It's biology, not politics." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Her squad mate, Corporal Davis, placed a warning hand on her arm. "Don't," he whispered. "He's not worth it," but the damage was done. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere. Sarah had worked twice as hard as any man in her unit to prove herself. She had completed every training exercise, passed every test, and exceeded every expectation. Yet here she was, having her capabilities questioned by someone who had never even seen her in action. That evening, as Sarah cleaned her rifle in preparation for the next day's patrol, she thought about Marcus's words. She had joined the military to serve her country, to make a difference. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had initially opposed her decision. "The military is no place for women," he had said, echoing the same sentiments she heard from men like Marcus every day. Sarah had proven her father wrong, just as she had proven wrong every instructor who doubted her during basic training. She had outperformed men twice her size in physical fitness tests, outshot seasoned marksmen at the rifle range, and demonstrated tactical awareness that impressed even the most skeptical commanders. The irony wasn't lost on her that Marcus Rivera, for all his bluster about women being unfit for combat, had never actually seen combat himself. He had spent his entire military career in training roles and administrative positions. His expertise came from textbooks and war movies, not from the harsh reality of warfare. As she methodically cleaned each component of her weapon, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. Tomorrow's patrol would be just another opportunity to prove that competence had nothing to do with gender. She had learned long ago that the only way to silence critics was through action, not words. The base was scheduled to send a reconnaissance patrol into a contested area where insurgent activity had been reported. It would be Sarah's first time leading a mixed squad that included Marcus Rivera. Command had specifically requested her for the mission due to her exceptional record and leadership skills, much to Marcus's visible displeasure. Sarah finished cleaning her rifle and began checking her gear methodically. Every piece of equipment was inspected, tested, and secured properly. This ritual had become second nature to her, a meditation that calmed her mind and prepared her body for the challenges ahead. Outside her barracks window, she could see other soldiers making their own preparations. Some wrote letters home, others called loved ones, and a few simply sat in contemplative silence. Everyone dealt with pre-mission anxiety differently, but they all felt it. Sarah thought about her younger sister, Emily, who looked up to her with admiration and pride. Emily often told her friends about her big sister who served overseas, defending freedom and democracy. Sarah carried that responsibility seriously, knowing that she represented more than just herself in uniform. The night air was cool and still, carrying the distant sounds of generators and radio chatter from the command center. Sarah stepped outside for a moment, breathing deeply and looking up at the stars. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and perhaps new chances to change minds like Marcus Rivera's. She had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, those very stars would witness acts of courage and sacrifice that would forever change how everyone in her unit viewed the question of women in combat. The test she faced wouldn't be written on paper or conducted on a training ground. It would be written in blood, sweat, and the kind of split-second decisions that separate heroes from casualties. As Sarah returned to her bunk to get a few hours of sleep before the mission briefing, she carried with her the weight of expectations, the burden of representation, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow would tell the story that words alone could never convey. The briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as 12 soldiers gathered around a detailed map of their patrol route. Captain Morrison pointed to various landmarks with a laser pointer, his voice steady and professional despite the gravity of the situation. "Intelligence reports suggest insurgent movement in this sector," he said, circling an area about 3 miles from base. "Your mission is reconnaissance only. Observe and report. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." His eyes swept across the assembled soldiers. "Sergeant Chen will be leading this patrol." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had led dozens of patrols before, but never with Marcus Rivera under her command. She could feel his skeptical gaze burning into the side of her face as she studied the terrain features on the map. "Questions?" Captain Morrison asked. Marcus raised his hand immediately. "Sir, with all due respect, wouldn't it be more appropriate for someone with more combat experience to lead this mission?" His tone was carefully measured, professional on the surface, but with an underlying challenge that everyone in the room could hear. The captain's expression hardened slightly. "Sergeant Chen has successfully led 43 reconnaissance patrols without losing a single soldier under her command. Unless you have specific tactical concerns, Sergeant Rivera, I suggest you focus on following orders rather than questioning them." The rebuke was gentle, but firm, and Marcus's face flushed red. He had overstepped and everyone knew it. Sarah kept her expression neutral, but inwardly she felt a surge of gratitude toward her commanding officer. "Equipment check in 30 minutes. Departure at 600, Sarah announced, taking control of the briefing. "Johnson, you're on point. Martinez, you handle communications. Rivera, you'll be covering R6. She assigned positions based on each soldier's strengths, keeping Marcus at the back where his attitude couldn't infect the rest of the squad. As the soldiers filed out to prepare their gear, Marcus lingered behind. "This isn't over," he muttered to Sarah as he passed. "When things go sideways out there, and they will, everyone will see what I've been trying to tell them." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "The only thing that's going to go sideways is your attitude if you don't check it at the door. These soldiers' lives depend on unit cohesion. Whatever personal issues you have with me, leave them here." The patrol left base as the sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, with rolling hills covered in scrub brush and scattered rocks that provided natural cover. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, constantly scanning for threats while keeping track of her squad's positioning. For the first 2 hours, everything went according to plan. They reached their first checkpoint without incident, and Sarah radioed their position back to base. The soldiers moved with quiet professionalism, communicating through hand signals and maintaining proper spacing. Marcus, despite his personal feelings, performed his duties competently. He was a skilled soldier, Sarah had to admit, even if his attitudes were stuck in another century. She could see him constantly watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake that would validate his prejudices. The trouble began when they approached a small village that intelligence had marked as potentially hostile. Sarah called for a halt and studied the settlement through her binoculars. Something felt wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. The village was too quiet, too still. "What's the holdup?" Marcus asked over the radio, impatience creeping into his voice. "Something's not right," Sarah replied. "The village is completely empty. No people, no animals, nothing moving." "Maybe they're just inside staying cool," Johnson suggested. "It's getting hot out here." Sarah shook her head, though the others couldn't see her. Her instincts were screaming danger, and she had learned to trust those instincts. They had saved her life and the lives of her soldiers more times than she could count. "We're going around," she decided. "Too risky to approach directly." "Are you kidding me?" Marcus's voice crackled through the radio. "We're supposed to be reconnaissance, not hide and seek. How are we supposed to gather intelligence if we're afraid to get close?" The challenge in his voice was unmistakable now. He was questioning her leadership openly, in front of the entire squad. Sarah felt every eye on her, waiting to see how she would respond. "This isn't a discussion, Rivera. We maintain a safe distance and observe from the ridgeline. But even as she gave the order, Sarah could see doubt creeping into some of the younger soldiers' faces. Marcus's insubordination was exactly what she had feared. He was undermining her authority at a critical moment, potentially putting everyone at risk. They moved to higher ground overlooking the village, where Sarah set up observation posts. Through her scope, she could see clear evidence that the village had been abandoned recently. Doors stood open, personal belongings were scattered in the streets, and there were tire tracks from heavy vehicles leading away from the settlement. "Martinez, radio this in," Sarah ordered. "Civilian population has been displaced, possibly by force. Recommend investigation by specialized units." As Martinez began transmitting their report, Sarah continued her surveillance of the village. Something was still bothering her, a nagging sense that they were missing something important. The abandonment looked staged, too convenient. That's when she saw it, a brief glint of sunlight reflecting off metal from a building at the far end of the village. Sarah adjusted her scope and felt her blood run cold. Armed figures were moving through the buildings using the abandoned structures as concealment. "Contact," she whispered into her radio. "Multiple hostiles in the village. We've walked into a trap." Before anyone could respond, the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions in the village, and Sarah heard the unmistakable whistle of incoming mortar rounds. Her worst fears were realized as she watched her carefully planned reconnaissance mission transform into a fight for survival. The first mortar round exploded 20 yards from their position, showering the squad with dirt and debris. Sarah's training kicked in instantly, her mind switching from observation mode to combat command in the space of a heartbeat. "Take cover! Suppressive fire on the village!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Martinez, call for immediate extraction." The soldiers scattered to defensive positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation on the ridgeline. Sarah could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire as her squad returned fire at the muzzle flashes coming from the village below. "Base, this is Patrol 7. Martinez's voice was steady despite the bullets whining overhead. "We are under heavy fire and request immediate extraction. Multiple hostiles, estimated 15 to 20 fighters." Marcus had taken cover behind a large boulder, his rifle barking as he laid down covering fire. Whatever his personal feelings about Sarah, he was fighting with the same intensity as everyone else. Survival had a way of making petty disagreements seem insignificant. "Johnson's hit," Corporal Davis called out. Sarah could see the young soldier, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He had taken shrapnel from the mortar round but was still conscious and alert. Sarah low-crawled to Johnson's position, keeping her head down as bullets snapped through the air above her. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site well. The squad was pinned down on high ground with limited cover and no easy escape route. "How bad?" she asked, examining Johnson's wound quickly. The shrapnel had torn through muscle but missed major arteries and bones. He would live, but he needed medical attention soon. "I can still fight," Johnson said through gritted teeth, trying to raise his rifle with his good arm. "Negative. You're staying down." Sarah turned to Davis. "Keep pressure on that wound. Don't let him do anything stupid." Another mortar round impacted closer this time, the concussion wave washing over them like a physical blow. Sarah could taste dust and smoke in her mouth as she scrambled back to her command position. "Base, we need that extraction now," Martinez called again. "We have wounded and are taking heavy fire." The radio crackled with static before the response came through. "Patrol 7, nearest available support is 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position?" 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours under these conditions. Sarah assessed their tactical situation with cold professionalism. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped on terrain that favored the attackers. The insurgents would likely try to flank their position soon. "We can't stay here," she announced to her squad. "They'll work around behind us and we'll be surrounded. We need to move to more defensible ground." She pointed to a rocky outcrop about 200 yards to their north. "That position gives us better fields of fire and multiple escape routes. We move in 2 groups, alternating covering fire." "Are you insane?" Marcus's voice came over the radio. "Moving across open ground under fire is suicide. We should stay put and wait for support." "If we stay here, we're dead," Sarah replied firmly. "Davis, you and Thompson take Johnson and move first. The rest of us will provide cover." As if to emphasize her point, another mortar round exploded directly behind their current position, sending rock fragments flying in all directions. One piece of shrapnel tore through Marcus's pack, destroying his water bottles. "Move now," Sarah ordered. Davis and Thompson hauled Johnson between them, running in a crouch toward the rocky outcrop, while the remaining soldiers laid down intensive covering fire. Sarah could see insurgents moving through the village, trying to get better angles on their position. The 3 soldiers made it to safety, diving behind the rocks just as a burst of automatic weapon fire kicked up dust where they had been running. Sarah felt a momentary surge of relief before focusing on the next phase of the movement. "Second group, get ready," she called out. "Martinez, Rivera, and Patterson, you're next." But as the second group prepared to move, Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. A group of insurgents had worked their way around the eastern side of the ridge and were setting up a machine gun position that would command the entire area between their current location and the rocky outcrop. If the second group tried to move now, they would be caught in a crossfire with nowhere to hide. "Abort! Abort!" Sarah screamed into her radio. "Machine gun position east side, 2 o'clock. The heavy machine gun opened fire just seconds later, its deep hammering sound drowning out everything else. The sustained burst tore up the ground where the second group would have been running, sending up geysers of dirt and rock chips. Marcus, who had been about to make the run, pressed himself against the ground as the bullets passed inches over his head. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt but had learned to control and channel into action. "We're trapped," Patterson said, his voice tight with panic. "They've got us surrounded." Sarah's mind raced through their options. The insurgents were methodically tightening the noose, using classic small unit tactics to pin down and destroy her patrol. She had to do something unexpected, something that would break their initiative and give her squad a fighting chance. That's when she noticed the dry creek bed that ran along the base of the ridge. It was partially concealed by scrub brush and would provide cover from the village but not from the machine gun position. However, if someone could work their way down there and flank the machine gun from behind, it would be incredibly dangerous. The person attempting it would be exposed to fire from multiple directions and would have to cover a lot of ground under combat conditions. But it might be their only chance. Sarah made her decision with the cold calculation that separated leaders from followers. She would have to leave her squad and attempt to neutralize the machine gun position single-handedly. It was a risk she couldn't ask anyone else to take. "Davis, you have command," Sarah said quietly into her radio. "Keep everyone's heads down and maintain suppressive fire on the village." "Don't let them advance. Where are you going?" Davis asked. But Sarah was already moving. She had spotted a narrow gully that ran down the backside of the ridge, concealed from both the village and the machine gun position. If she could reach it without being seen, she might be able to work her way around behind the insurgents who were about to overrun her squad. Sarah slithered on her belly toward the gully, using every rock and bush as cover. Bullets continued to snap overhead, but the insurgents couldn't see her from their positions. She had done this kind of movement dozens of times in training, but never with her squad's lives hanging in the balance. The gully was deeper than it looked from above. Carved out by years of flash floods during the rainy season, Sarah dropped into it and began working her way east, staying low and moving as quietly as possible. The sound of gunfire was muffled by the earthen walls around her. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, Sarah reached a point where she could climb out and survey the machine gun position. 3 insurgents had set up their weapon behind a low stone wall, with a clear field of fire across the entire ridge where her squad was trapped. Sarah checked her ammunition and hand grenades methodically. She had 1 fragmentation grenade and enough rounds for a sustained firefight, but she would have to get close enough to make every shot count. The insurgents were alert and well-positioned, scanning constantly for threats. Meanwhile, back at the ridge, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Marcus could see insurgents moving through the village, getting closer to positions where they could launch a direct assault on the trapped soldiers. Johnson was losing blood despite Davis's best efforts to treat his wound. "Where the hell is Chen?" Marcus muttered, reloading his rifle with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. "She's doing what leaders do," Davis replied sharply, "taking risks so the rest of us might live." Marcus fell silent, focusing on his rifle scope as he searched for targets in the village below. He had never been in a situation this desperate before. Never had to trust his life completely to someone else's tactical decisions. The theoretical discussions he had enjoyed in the mess hall seemed absurd now. Sarah waited for the right moment, watching the machine gun crew through the scope of her rifle. They were disciplined soldiers, taking turns scanning different sectors and maintaining good fire discipline. But they had made one crucial mistake. They hadn't posted a rear guard. When the machine gunner paused to reload, Sarah made her move. She sprinted from cover toward the stone wall, covering 30 yards of open ground in seconds. The insurgents heard her coming at the last moment, but it was too late. Sarah's first shot dropped the gunner before he could swing his weapon around. Her second shot took down the assistant gunner as he reached for his rifle. The third insurgent managed to get off a wild burst of automatic fire before Sarah's return fire silenced him permanently. The sudden cessation of machine gun fire was immediately noticed by both sides. Sarah's squad realized their flanking threat had been eliminated, while the insurgents in the village understood that their ambush was falling apart. The machine guns down, Davis reported over the radio.
Chen got them!
But Sarah's fight was far from over. The sound of gunfire had attracted attention from other insurgents in the area, and she could hear shouting voices getting closer to her position. She had maybe a minute before they surrounded her. Sarah grabbed the machine gun and turned it toward the village, using the insurgents' own weapon against them. The heavy caliber rounds tore through the abandoned buildings where the attackers had taken cover, forcing them to relocate or retreat. Second group, move now, Sarah called over the radio while maintaining suppressive fire. I'll cover you. Marcus, Martinez, and Patterson sprinted across the open ground toward the rocky outcrop, with Sarah's machine gun fire keeping the insurgents' heads down. They made it to safety just as Sarah's ammunition belt ran empty. Now came the hardest part. Sarah had to get back to her squad while insurgents converged on her position from multiple directions. She could hear them calling to each other in their native language, coordinating their movements to cut off her escape routes. Sarah abandoned the empty machine gun and began working her way back toward the gully, but insurgents were already moving to block that route. She was trapped in the same way her squad had been trapped just minutes earlier. That's when the mortar rounds started falling around her position. The insurgents were willing to risk hitting their own people to eliminate the soldier who had disrupted their ambush. Sarah threw herself behind the stone wall as explosions walked closer and closer to her hiding spot. A near miss showered her with debris and left her ears ringing, but she forced herself to keep moving. The gully was no longer an option, but there was another route, straight up the rocky slope toward her squad's new position. It would mean running uphill under fire from multiple directions, completely exposed, with insurgents closing in from behind. But it was her only chance to rejoin her soldiers before they were overwhelmed by a renewed attack from the village. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and prepared to make the run of her life. Sarah burst from cover and began the desperate climb up the rocky slope, her legs pumping as bullets whistled past her head. The insurgents had anticipated her move and were ready, their rifle fire converging on her position as she zigzagged between boulders and scraggly bushes. From the rocky outcrop above, her squad provided covering fire, but they had to be careful not to hit Sarah as she climbed toward them. Marcus found himself leaning into his rifle scope, picking his shots with precision he had never demonstrated before. "Come on, Chen," he muttered under his breath, surprised by his own intensity. "Move, move, move!" A bullet sparked off a rock inches from Sarah's head, sending stone fragments into her face. She ignored the stinging cuts and kept climbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the slope grew steeper. Behind her, she could hear insurgents shouting as they pursued her up the hillside. 50 yards from safety, Sarah's luck ran out. A burst of automatic fire caught her in the right leg, sending her tumbling behind a small boulder. Pain shot through her body like lightning, and she could feel warm blood soaking through her uniform pants. "Chen's down," Patterson called out. "She's hit." Sarah examined her wound quickly. The bullet had passed through her thigh muscle, missing the bone but tearing up tissue and blood vessels. She could still move, but not quickly. The insurgents would catch up to her position in less than a minute. That's when Marcus Rivera made a decision that would haunt and honor him for the rest of his life. Without hesitation, he slung his rifle across his back and started down the slope toward Sarah's position. "Rivera, what are you doing?" Davis called after him. What should have been done a long time ago, Marcus replied, his voice grim with determination. He reached Sarah's position just as the first insurgents appeared on the slope below them. Marcus threw himself down behind the boulder next to Sarah, his rifle already in his hands and firing at the approaching threats. "You're an idiot," Sarah said through gritted teeth. "You should have stayed in cover." "Yeah, well, apparently I'm full of bad decisions today," Marcus replied, dropping one insurgent with a well-placed shot. "Can you move?" "Not fast enough." Sarah tried to put weight on her wounded leg and nearly collapsed. The blood loss was making her dizzy, and she could feel her strength ebbing away. Marcus assessed their tactical situation with brutal honesty. They were pinned down by at least 6 insurgents below them, with limited ammunition and one wounded soldier who couldn't move effectively. The rest of their squad was too far away to provide direct assistance. "I'm going to carry you," Marcus announced, already stripping off his pack to reduce weight. "Don't be ridiculous. You can't carry me and fight at the same time. Leave me here and get back to the squad." "Not happening." Marcus's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "I spent 3 years telling everyone you couldn't handle combat. I'll be damned if I'm going to prove myself right by abandoning you now." Before Sarah could protest further, Marcus hauled her up and across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. The sudden movement sent fresh waves of pain through her wounded leg, but she gritted her teeth and endured it. The climb that followed would become the stuff of legend in their unit. Marcus carried Sarah's full weight up the steep rocky slope, while insurgents fired at them from multiple positions. He moved with determination born of desperation, his legs burning with fatigue as he fought for every yard of elevation. Sarah, despite her pain and blood loss, managed to provide covering fire over Marcus's shoulder. Her rifle barked repeatedly as she engaged targets that Marcus couldn't see, using her elevated position to spot threats and neutralize them before they could get close. "Left side, 2 o'clock, Sarah called out, her voice weak but clear. Her bullet caught an insurgent just as he was raising his rifle to fire at them. Marcus's lungs felt like they were on fire, and his vision was starting to blur from exhaustion. Sarah wasn't a small woman, and her combat gear added another 30 pounds to her body weight. But he kept moving, driven by something deeper than physical strength. Halfway up the slope, a mortar round exploded close enough to knock them both down. Marcus lost his footing and they tumbled several yards downhill, before he managed to regain his balance and start climbing again. Sarah's wound had reopened during the fall and she was leaving a trail of blood on the rocks behind them. "Almost there," Marcus gasped, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to encourage Sarah or himself. His legs were shaking with fatigue and every step was an act of pure willpower. The covering fire from their squad intensified as Marcus and Sarah approached the rocky outcrop. Davis and the others had realized what was happening and were doing everything possible to suppress the insurgents' fire during the final phase of the climb. With 20 yards to go, Marcus stumbled and nearly fell. His strength was completely gone and his vision was graying around the edges from exhaustion. But Sarah's voice in his ear kept him moving. "You can do this," she whispered. "Don't quit on me now, Rivera." Marcus found reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. He took one step, then another, climbing steadily toward safety while bullets continued to snap past them. The rocky outcrop grew larger and more detailed as they approached, until finally eager hands reached out to pull them to safety. Davis and Thompson hauled both soldiers behind the protective rocks, while Martinez immediately began working on Sarah's wound with the squad's medical kit. Marcus collapsed completely, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "You did it," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "You actually did it." Marcus looked at her through eyes clouded with exhaustion and something else he couldn't quite identify. Everything he thought he knew about combat, about courage, about the capabilities of his fellow soldiers, had been turned upside down in the space of 30 minutes. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance announced the arrival of their extraction team, but Marcus barely heard it. He was staring at Sarah Chen, the woman he had spent years claiming couldn't handle combat, the soldier who had just saved his squad through tactical brilliance and personal courage that put his own contributions to shame. For the first time in his military career, Marcus Rivera had nothing to say. The helicopter evacuation went smoothly, with Sarah and Johnson both receiving immediate medical attention during the flight back to base. Sarah's leg wound required surgery, but the doctors assured her that she would make a full recovery and returned to active duty within 2 months. Marcus spent the flight in contemplative silence, staring out the window at the landscape that had nearly claimed all their lives. His fellow soldiers were talking about Sarah's tactical brilliance and courage, but Marcus could barely process what he was hearing. Everything he had believed about women in combat lay in ruins. The debriefing took place 3 days later in the same conference room where the mission had been planned. Captain Morrison led the session, with all surviving members of the patrol present. Sarah attended despite her injuries, using crutches to move around but insisting on participating in the full discussion. Sergeant Chen's tactical decisions under fire were exemplary, Captain Morrison began, reading from his preliminary report. Her recognition of the ambush threat probably saved the entire squad from being overrun in the initial attack. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He had written his own report of the incident, and every paragraph had been a lesson in humility. The woman he had publicly dismissed as unfit for combat had demonstrated tactical awareness and leadership ability that exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. The decision to neutralize the machine gun position through individual action showed exceptional courage and tactical judgment, the captain continued. Sergeant Rivera's subsequent rescue of Sergeant Chen under fire also demonstrates the kind of unit cohesion and mutual support that makes our military effective. After the formal debriefing, Marcus found himself alone with Sarah in the hallway outside the conference room. She was adjusting her crutches, preparing to navigate the long walk back to the medical facility. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said quietly. "More than an apology, actually." Sarah looked at him with eyes that held no anger, just a quiet sadness. "You don't owe me anything, Rivera. You carried me 5 miles under fire. I'd say we're even." "No, we're not." Marcus's voice was firm. "I spent 3 years undermining your authority and questioning your abilities in front of other soldiers. I created a hostile work environment based on prejudices I never bothered to examine." Sarah leaned against the wall, taking weight off her injured leg. "Why? What did I ever do to you personally?" It was a simple question, but one that Marcus had been avoiding for years. The honest answer was that Sarah had never done anything to him. Her competence and success had threatened his assumptions about gender roles and military capability, and he had lashed out rather than confront his own biases. "Nothing," he admitted. "You never did anything except be better at this job than I wanted to admit." The silence stretched between them, heavy with 3 years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Marcus could hear the distant sounds of the base continuing its daily operations, soldiers going about their duties in the same way they had before the patrol that changed everything. "I wrote a letter to my sister yesterday," Marcus said finally. "She's thinking about joining the military after college. For years I've been telling her she should consider other options, that the military isn't really suitable for women." Sarah raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I tore up that letter and wrote a new one. I told her that if she decides to join, she'll be serving alongside some of the finest soldiers I've ever known, regardless of their gender." 2 weeks later, Marcus requested a meeting with Captain Morrison to discuss his future role in the unit. He had been doing a lot of thinking since the patrol, not just about Sarah but about his leadership style and the example he set for younger soldiers. "I want to recommend Sergeant Chen for promotion to Staff Sergeant," Marcus said during the meeting. "Her tactical abilities and leadership under pressure exceed those of anyone else in the unit, including myself." Captain Morrison studied Marcus carefully. "This is quite a change from your previous assessments of Sergeant Chen's capabilities." "My previous assessments were wrong," Marcus said simply. "They were based on prejudice rather than performance. I let my personal biases cloud my professional judgment, and it nearly got people killed." The captain nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, Sergeant Rivera. What else did you want to discuss?" "I want to request a transfer to a different unit," Marcus continued. "Sergeant Chen has earned the respect and trust of everyone in this squad. My presence here is a constant reminder of the divisions I created. The unit would function better without me." Captain Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering Marcus's words carefully. "Running away from your mistakes isn't the same as learning from them, Sergeant. How do I know this change in attitude is genuine and permanent?" It was a fair question, and Marcus had prepared for it. "Because I have to look at myself in the mirror every morning knowing that my prejudices almost cost the lives of 12 good soldiers. Because Private Johnson still has nightmares about that patrol. and Sergeant Chen walks with a slight limp that will probably never go away completely. The captain was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face for any signs of insincerity or manipulation. What he saw was genuine remorse and a man struggling to rebuild his identity around a new understanding of himself and others. "Transfer denied," Captain Morrison said finally. "You created a problem in this unit and you're going to stay here and help fix it. I want you to work directly with Sergeant Chen on developing new training protocols for mixed-gender squads." Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Working closely with Sarah would be challenging, but it was also an opportunity to make amends in a meaningful way. When Sarah returned to active duty 6 weeks later, she found a dramatically changed dynamic in the unit. Marcus had used his influence among the male soldiers to champion her leadership and tactical abilities. The casual sexism that had once been tolerated in the barracks was now actively discouraged. The first joint training exercise they conducted together was awkward but professional. Marcus deferred to Sarah's expertise without question, and gradually the other soldiers began to see their interaction as the new normal rather than an exception. 3 months after the patrol, Sarah was indeed promoted to staff sergeant, with Marcus's enthusiastic recommendation carrying significant weight in the decision. During the promotion ceremony, she thanked her fellow soldiers for their support and dedication. Marcus watched from the audience as Sarah spoke about the importance of unit cohesion and mutual respect. She didn't mention him specifically, but their eyes met for a moment across the assembled soldiers, and he saw something there that might have been forgiveness. After the ceremony, as soldiers mingled and congratulated Sarah on her promotion, Marcus found himself approached by several younger soldiers who wanted to know about the patrol that had become legendary within the unit. "Is it true that Sergeant Chen single-handedly took out a machine gun position?" Private Williams asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "It's true," Marcus replied. "I've never seen tactical thinking and personal courage like that before." "And you really carried her 5 miles under fire?" Another soldier pressed. Marcus nodded, but his expression grew serious. "I did what any soldier would do for a wounded comrade. But let me tell you something more important. Sergeant Chen saved all our lives that day through superior leadership and tactical brilliance. She's the kind of soldier you want leading you into combat." As the crowd dispersed and soldiers returned to their regular duties, Marcus realized that he had finally found his voice as a leader. Instead of tearing others down to build himself up, he was learning to lift others up and find strength in their collective success. The mess hall conversations were different now, too. When new soldiers arrived and made comments about women in combat roles, they quickly found themselves educated by veterans who had seen Sarah's leadership firsthand. The culture was changing one conversation at a time. Marcus Rivera never became best friends with Sarah Chen, but he became something more valuable, a genuine ally and advocate. He learned that true strength wasn't about proving others weak, but about recognizing and supporting excellence wherever it appeared. Years later, when Marcus was asked about the most important lesson of his military career, he would always tell the same story. It was about a patrol that went wrong, a leader who rose to the occasion, and a man who discovered that his assumptions about courage, leadership, and capability had been completely backwards. The story would end with him saying, "She carried all of us that day even while I was carrying her." That's what real leadership looks like.